After surviving a fall into the river that everyone insisted was just an accident, I moved in with my daughter's family to recover. But the very next morning, my granddaughter quietly stood beside my bed and whispered, "Grandpa, you need to leave this house." I asked her why. She grabbed my hand tightly, pulled me toward the air vent in the wall, and said softly, "Look." I leaned closer and looked inside and froze when I discovered something horrifying blinking right in front of my eyes. Welcome to our story. Before we begin, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from around the world. Also share if your grandchild warned you like that. Would you stay or leave? This is a fictional story dramatized to provide an engaging experience with meaningful insights. The water of the Ashley River doesn't just move, it swallows. And as the cold current filled my lungs, I realized the man I'd called son for 5 years had finally stopped pretending to love me. My name is Thane Garrison, a 68-year-old retired architect with a silver mane and eyes that still measured the world in blueprints. And I stood silently by the Ashley River on that May morning in 2022, unaware my life was about to be dismantled. I have always lived by the logic of structures. A good foundation is invisible until the storm hits. I used to tell my students back at the university, but I had failed to notice the rot in my own house. The Charleston Promenade was my sanctuary, a place where the rhythmic sound of the tide against the stone offered a predictable geometry to my thoughts. The humidity was already thickening, a heavy blanket that smelled of salt and brackish marsh. Yet I felt a strange sense of peace. I watched the low morning sun glinting off the ripples, thinking of the drafting table I'd left at home and the sketches for the new community center that still needed my touch. My life was a series of well-planned lines and reinforced concrete, or so I believed. I felt the familiar weight of my age in my knees, but my mind remained as sharp as a laser level. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone who shares your dinner table and realized they were measuring you for a casket? The thought struck me only when the shadow fell across my path. Preston Ward, 41, moved with the rehearsed grace of a hedge fund manager. His expensive running gear a sharp contrast to the morning mist as he approached me. His father-in-law. He looked healthy, vibrant, and entirely out of place in the quiet solitude of my morning walk. He smiled, but it was a structural facade, a veneer that didn't reach his predatory eyes. "You look tired." "Thane," he said, his voice carrying a feigned concern that made the hair on my neck stand up. "Maybe the walk is getting to be too much for a man your age." I turned to look at him, gripping the slick, rusted railing of the Riverwalk. "I've never felt sharper." "Preston," I replied, keeping my tone as steady as a load-bearing beam. "Can you say the same for your fund?" I'd heard the rumors of his losses, the cracks forming in his financial empire, but I didn't expect the sudden shift in the air. His face hardened the mask of the beautiful son-in-law, slipping to reveal the cold calculation beneath. Then came the shove. No words, just gravity and the betrayal of a hand I'd shaken 1,000 times. The railing gave way, not because of age, but because it had been tampered with, the bolts loosened by a hand that knew my routine. I hit the water with a bone-jarring shock. The Ashley River was an icy tomb, and the weight of my waterlogged clothes pulled me down into the dark. The burning sensation of salt water in my lungs was an agonizing fire. I clawed at the surface, but the current was a physical weight, a liquid hand pressing me into the silt. Just as the darkness began to close in, a strong hand grabbed my collar. Jim Rodriguez, a 28-year-old competitive swimmer, with the lean, powerful build of an athlete in his prime, hauled me toward the muddy bank. He had been doing his morning training laps in the river, his sleek wet suit still dripping as he pulled me to safety. "Stay with me, sir." "Breathe," he shouted, his voice urgent and commanding. I gasped, coughing up the river, my vision a blurring mess of salt and sun. Through the haze, I saw Preston's silhouette on the promenade above. He wasn't reaching for his phone. He was checking his watch. Jim looked up at the promenade, his sharp eyes narrowing as he caught sight of Preston. "I saw him up there," Sir Jim said quietly, his breath still heavy from the rescue. I saw someone near you right before you fell. But Preston was already moving his phone now pressed to his ear, his voice carrying across the water with practiced panic. Help! My father-in-law fell. Please send an ambulance. The performance had begun, and I was too weak to speak the truth. The siren's wail cut through the morning like a jagged blade, but it was the silence of the man standing above me that truly chilled my blood. Preston didn't flee or hide after he watched the river try to swallow me. Instead, he embedded himself in the rescue, using his feigned concern as a shield to control the narrative from the very first second. I lay on the muddy bank, gasping for air that felt like liquid fire in my lungs, while the paramedics scrambled down the slope toward us. My son-in-law stepped forward, his face contorting into an Oscar-worthy performance of panic. Oh, God thing. He cried out, his voice loud enough for every arriving responder to hear. I turned my head for 1 second. How did you trip? I tried to speak, but my throat was a raw cavern of salt and silt, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. Jim Rodriguez, the heavy-set fisherman with weathered skin and a soul as deep as the Ashley, hovered near the gurney. Jim's eyes were filled with a suspicion the police hadn't yet noticed. He didn't trip, Jim said firmly, pointing a calloused finger toward the promenade. I saw someone near him. Preston didn't miss a beat, stepping directly into the fisherman's line of sight and waving over a medic. Please, he's in shock. Preston interrupted, his voice, dripping with synthetic grief. Focus on his breathing. He's been so unsteady lately. I felt the scratchy wool of a blanket being tucked around my seizing muscles as they hoisted me onto the gurney. Powerless fury burned in my gut, but I could do nothing but watch Preston steal my voice. Being in that ambulance was like being buried alive in a box of neon lights and sterile plastic with my own murderer holding my hand. The rhythmic thumping of the ambulance floor vibrated through my skull as the smell of ozone and rubbing alcohol filled the cramped space. Preston leaned over me, his shadow blocking out the flickering lights. Save your strength, Dad, he whispered, his face inches from mine. You're confused. Just breathe. I clawed at his arm, my fingers leaving faint red marks on his expensive sleeve. P pushed. I managed to croak, but the word was lost under the hum of the engine and the medic's sudden report. His vitals are erratic, the paramedic noted, misinterpreting my terror for a heart under stress. Imagine the person who just tried to end your life being the only one the world trusts to save it. When we arrived at Charleston Medical Center, the world became a blur of harsh, flickering fluorescent lights and the sharp scent of antiseptic. Preston stayed behind to talk to the admitting nurse, seeding the poison before I even touched a bed. He's 68, I heard him say through the open door of the trauma bay, but he's been acting much older lately. I was afraid something like this would happen. He was building a cage out of my own aging body, and the doctors were handing him the lock as the curtain was pulled shut, isolating me in a sea of sterile white. Preston stepped into the trauma bay and leaned in close. He leaned in so close I could smell the expensive espresso on his breath, and for the first time, I saw the true monster behind the tailored suit. It's a long way down. Thane. He whispered, his voice as cold as the river silt. You should have stayed under. The rhythmic, steady beep of the heart monitor was a taunt, a digital metronome counting down the seconds until my autonomy was officially declared dead. There is a specific kind of terror in being sane while the world around you is being convinced politely and professionally that your mind is a rotting structure. I lay trapped in the ER bed, the texture of the plastic ID band biting into my wrist while Preston stood at the foot of my bed. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Dr. Eris Thorne, a neurologist with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice as sterile as the surgical steel he likely favored, who looked at my chart with the detached curiosity of a man examining a failing circuit board. Preston's performance was masterful. He's been forgetting names. Doctor, he said, his voice dropping to a confidential, mournful tone. Last week, he thought it was 1995. I think the river was just the breaking point. I tried to shout to tell the truth, But my protest came out as a raspy, erratic wheeze. That's a lie. I managed to croak the thick cottonmouth feeling of the sedative making my tongue feel like lead. I remember the shove. I remember his hands. Preston simply sighed, a sound of profound patience that made the doctor nod in sympathy. You see, Preston whispered, he's agitated, hallucinating. It's the shock. Doctor. Thorne stepped closer, the smell of floor wax and stale air clinging to his lab coat. He didn't look at the fear in my eyes. He looked at the dilation of my pupils. If a man loses his home, he's a victim. If he loses his mind, he's a burden. Which one do you think is easier to get rid of? As the doctor began a cognitive assessment, I realized the trap was closing. Thane, do you know who the president is? He asked. I knew the answer. But as I opened my mouth, the room began to tilt. The fluorescent ceiling lights blurred into long white streaks. My head. It's spinning. I stammered. Why won't you listen about Preston? The doctor made a notation on his tablet, a look of pity in his eyes that was more painful than the water in my lungs. Thane realizes that the sedative the nurse gave him wasn't standard procedure. Preston had whispered something to the staff about his violent outbursts, ensuring I would be too drugged to defend myself during the evaluation. My memories were like blueprints left out in the rain ink running lines, blurring until the structure I knew was gone. By the time the doctor left, I was drifting in a chemical fog. Preston lingered for a moment, his tailored silhouette framed by the door. Sleep well, Dad, he said, and the lights dimmed for my rest. I stared at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling, trying to reconstruct the morning with an architect's precision. I built skyscrapers that resisted hurricanes. I thought, so, how can I be falling apart now? I reached up to adjust my wristband, my fingers fumbling against the plastic when I felt something. A small, crumpled scrap of paper was tucked under the edge of the band. I pulled it out with trembling fingers, squinting at the messy scrawl. It wasn't from a doctor, but from Milo. I saw him leave early. He didn't have his running shoes on. The note from my grandson was a thin lifeline in a sea of lies, but it confirmed the most terrifying truth of all. The hunt hadn't ended at the river. It had just moved indoors. The thin scrap of paper from Milo remained hidden in the palm of my hand, a rough edge of truth cutting through the chemical fog. Freedom usually comes with a discharge paper, but as the orderly locked the brakes on my wheelchair, I realized I wasn't being released. I was being transferred to a different kind of custody. The antiseptic smell of the hospital clung to my clothes like a second skin, a reminder of the institutional walls that had just failed to protect me. I watched my daughter, Leona Ward, a 40-year-old interior designer, whose life was as carefully curated as the hospital room she now paced. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and hidden shame, her hands smoothing a silk scarf that probably cost more than my first drafting table. I insisted on calling a cab to my own historic home on Trad Street, but she dismissed the idea with a wave of her hand. I built that house with my own hands. Leona, I said, my voice still a raspy grate. I'm going home. Dad, you almost drowned, she replied, using a tone of forced maternal concern that made my skin crawl. The doctor says, you're not tracking reality. You're coming to stay with us in Mount Pleasant. It was then I saw the folder in her bag, a legal document confirming she had already initiated a temporary emergency guardianship filing, using my disorientation as the primary weight to tip the scales. The hospital gown felt like a white flag. I was being forced to wave a surrender of every brick and beam I'd ever laid in this city. I wanted to scream that I was the architect of my own life, but the medications made my tongue feel like a heavy soden plank. Leona helped me into her luxury SUV, the door closing with a soft, expensive thud that isolated me from the world. As we exited the hospital grounds, I watched the familiar streets of Charleston blur past through the stale recycled air of the car's climate control. I reached into my pocket for my phone, needing to find Jim Rodriguez, but the device I pulled out was a useless slab of glass. The screen was shattered and the battery was dead, conveniently forgotten by Preston during the chaos of my admission. "Where's my phone?" "Leona?" I asked, feeling the isolation settle into my bones. "It's broken." "Dad," she said without looking at me. "Preston is getting it fixed. Just look at the scenery. Isn't it beautiful?" Have you ever noticed how the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who know exactly which nerves to pinch to make you stop fighting? We crossed the Arthur Ravenel Jr. Bridge. The vibration of the engine hummed through the seat as the blinding sun reflected off the Cooper River below. I looked down at the water, the same water that had nearly claimed me, and realized that by crossing this river, I was moving further from the witnesses of my life. Leona's grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled, her knuckles ghost-white against the leather. "You're shaking." "Leona," I observed. "Is everything all right at home?" "Everything is perfect." She whispered, her voice tight. "It has to be." As we pulled into the driveway, a professional security van was just pulling away. Preston had been busy. The gates of the Mount Pleasant estate clicked shut behind us with a finality that sounded like a prison bolt sliding home. And there, standing on the porch, was Preston waiting with a smile that never reached his eyes. The scent of jasmine in Mount Pleasant is thick enough to choke a man, a sweet, cloying perfume meant to mask the smell of stagnant water and old rot-filled secrets. As the heavy gates clicked shut, I felt the physical weight of Preston's hand on my shoulder, a grip that was less about support and more about a claim of ownership. He guided me up the stairs past the elegant master suite Leona had surely decorated with her usual curated perfection to a converted attic space on the third floor. "We thought you'd appreciate the privacy up here," the Preston said, his voice smooth as polished marble, away from the noise of the kids. I looked around the room, my architect's eye immediately cataloging the modifications. Privacy, Preston, or just a clear line of sight for those lenses in the crown molding? I asked, pointing to the discreet, high-resolution cameras nestled in the woodwork. He didn't blink, simply setting my bag on a sparse, clean chair that smelled of fresh paint. The chemical tang was sharp, a specific industrial solvent used to strip old lead, which was strange for a new build. It hit the back of my throat, a physical trigger meant to incite the very headaches and confusion he wanted to document. I stood on the cold, polished hardwood and felt the house tightening around me like a well-designed trap. Preston's hospitality was a velvet glove wrapped around a knuckles of brass. It looked soft, but every time he touched my shoulder, I felt the bone-deep bruise of his intentions. "We value routine in this house, Dad," he told me later at the dinner table. "It helps keep everyone focused." I looked at the oversalted, expensive steak on my plate, and then at my grandchildren. Milo Ward, a lanky 12-year-old with my own sharp gaze, sat with a posture so rigid it looked painful, his eyes darting toward the security sensors in the corners. Beside him, 8-year-old Lark Ward clutched her fork, watching her father with eyes that saw far more than a child ever should. "Focused on what, Preston?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the chemical haze beginning to cloud my mind. "The next quarterly report, or the next accident?" Leona looked away, her silence, a load-bearing wall for Preston's ego. The tension was an audible hum, rivaled only by the high-efficiency HVAC system pushing that tainted air through the vents. Then I saw it, the hole where the lock should be, a void in the wood that told me I was no longer a guest, but a specimen. After dinner, Preston intercepted me in the upper hallway, handing me a printed itinerary. It listed cognitive exercises and mandatory rest periods, like a prison schedule. "It's for your own safety. Thane," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "In case you wander during one of your episodes." He gestured to my door where the lock had been removed and replaced with a simple latch that could only be engaged from the outside. I stepped into my room, the clicking sound of the hallway cameras adjusting their focus, following me like a persistent insect. As I prepared to close the door, I caught a glimpse of Lark in the shadows of the nursery wing. She didn't wave or speak. She simply placed a single finger over her lips and pointed toward the ventilation grate in my ceiling. I looked at the grate she had indicated, the metal slats humming with the central air, and I realized I wasn't just being watched. I was being listened to. The nightmare didn't end when I opened my eyes. It just traded the black water of the Ashley for the suffocating silence of a house that wanted me dead. I lay awake in that third floor or attic room, my lungs still feeling heavy, as if the river silt had never truly left them. Above me, the ventilation grate hummed with a low, persistent vibration. It was a rhythmic pulse that I realized was far too consistent for a standard HVAC system. As an architect, I knew the acoustic properties of a home like this, and I soon discovered that the humming was actually a white noise generator. It was a clever structural addition designed to mask the sounds of Preston and Leona moving around the floors below while they finalized whatever plan required my quiet disappearance. The chemical smell from the walls, that sharp tang of industrial solvent, grew thicker in the humid midnight air. It made my head throb and my thoughts scatter into jagged fragments exactly as Preston intended. I forced myself to focus. Walls don't just speak thing. I whispered to the empty room. They record. I mapped the house's layout in my mind, tracing the ductwork and the reinforced floorboards, searching for a flaw in the cage. A faint metallic click sounded at the door, the latch being lifted from the outside. I tensed my heart, hammering against my ribs as a small figure slipped into the room, silhouetted by the pale moonlight. It was Milo, his frame looking fragile and trembling as he held a small electronic device. He moved with a ghostly quiet toward my bedside. "Grandpa, don't make a sound." He breathed, his voice so low it was almost lost to the white noise. "The vents. He can hear your breathing." "Milo, what are you doing here?" I asked, reaching out to touch his arm. "You're shaking." "Son." He didn't answer, just gripped my hand with fingers that felt like ice. "You have to see the papers," he insisted. "He thinks you're too far gone to care, but he's cleaning out everything." "How do you tell a 12-year-old that the man who gave him his name is the same man trying to erase yours?" I didn't have the words, so I simply followed him. Milo led me out of the room, guiding me with a terrifying expertise through the shadows. He knew exactly which floorboards to avoid so as not to trigger the sensors Preston had installed. We descended to the second floor, the heavy rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock downstairs marking the time like a heartbeat. We stopped before a heavy mahogany door that Preston kept triple locked. Milo produced a key he had swiped from Preston's gym bag and slowly inserted it. The key turned. A cold, heavy sound. The sound of a vault opening or a grave. "He's in the office every night until 4. Milo whispered, "We only have 20 minutes. As he pushed the door open, I noticed something that made my blood run colder than the river water. Milo was wearing his running shoes, the neon-trimmed pair Preston claimed he had been wearing during his own run that morning. My grandson hadn't just heard about the accident. He was there. He had seen the push. Milo's hand gripped mine, his knuckles white as he pushed the door open to reveal a room bathed in the blue. Sickly glow of 3 computer monitors and a desk covered in files with my name on them. Stepping into that office felt like walking into a crime scene that hadn't happened yet. A room where my entire existence had been reduced to spreadsheets and cold calculated risks. The smell of stale coffee and the sight of a folder labeled with my social security number greeted me as the door clicked shut behind Milo and me. I quickly realized that the contingency folder I found on top had been created 6 months ago, proving that the river incident wasn't a sudden impulse, but a long-term strategy meticulously drafted by the man my daughter called her husband. The office was bathed in the sickly blue light reflecting off 3 massive computer monitors, the glow dancing across Milo's glasses as he watched the door. A hard drive word in the background, a mechanical heartbeat in a room filled with digital shadows. On the screens, I saw the true state of Preston's world. He was logged into a private server for his hedge fund, but the charts weren't climbing. I observed a series of red alert graphs showing a total collapse of investor capital, a bleeding crimson line that contrasted sharply with the success he projected to the world at dinner. Milo pointed to a specific physical drawer beneath the heavy mahogany desk, one that was reinforced with steel and seemingly out of place in a modern home office. "He spends hours here." Grandpa Milo whispered, his voice trembling. He doesn't look at stocks. He looks at this. I looked at the cascading losses on the screen and shook my head. Those numbers are bleeding. Milo, this isn't a fund. It's a furnace. I reached for the drawer, the metal cold against my skin. Looking through these files was like seeing my own autopsy while my heart was still beating. I pulled out a thick leather-bound folder that felt unnecessarily heavy in my hands. It wasn't just a business file. It was an archive of my own life. Inside, the dry, papery smell of old blueprints filled the small space. "Why does he have my blueprints from 1985? I asked, flipping through original drafts of the Charleston Library. "He says he's just protecting the family assets." Milo said, "But he's been selling things, hasn't he?" I ignored the question, my eyes landing on a red folder at the very bottom of the drawer. It was labeled Garrison Contingency Phase 2. How much is a life worth in a falling market? For Preston, the answer was exactly $3.5 million. My hands shook as I flipped it open to find a printed draft of a massive life insurance policy listing Preston Ward as the sole beneficiary. Below it lay a forged power of attorney document, the ink mocking me with its professional precision. "This isn't my signature," I whispered. "I never signed this." My eyes traced the notary seal at the bottom and the breath left my lungs. The name Marcus Webb was embossed in the gold foil. I noticed the date. It was notarized. It was the day before my wife Helen's funeral, while I was too grief-stricken to even notice Preston was missing from the house for an hour. I stared at the name Marcus Webb on the notary seal, and a cold memory flickered. A man I'd seen Leona talking to at the hospital. A man who wasn't a doctor at all. The structure of my family hadn't just cracked. It had been rigged for a controlled demolition. The memory of the man Leona had spoken to at the hospital, Marcus Webb, sent a chill through me that the office air conditioning couldn't match. Marcus Webb, 52, was a man with the stillness of a maritime lawyer who knew exactly where the bodies were buried and how to keep them there. Have you ever found the price tag for your own murder hidden among the family photos? I dug deeper into the contingency folder while Milo stood guard, his eyes darting toward the office door. The $3.5 million policy wasn't just a document. It was a blueprint for my liquidation. I traced the premium payments and found they were being funneled through a shell company linked directly to Preston's failing fund. The accidental drowning rider would double the payout, a detail that turned my stomach. "Grandpa, look at the dates," Milo whispered, his voice cracking. "These withdrawals, they started the month Mom and Dad bought this house." I stared at a secondary ledger Milo had pulled from the stack. My daughter Leona hadn't just been a passive observer. Her signature appeared on several withdrawal slips from my private retirement accounts totaling nearly $500,000. They didn't just want me dead. Milo, they've already started eating my ghost. The betrayal was a structural failure, a load-bearing wall of my life crumbling in real time. My rage was cold and calculating, an architect's anger at a sabotaged design. I turned the page and found something even more sinister. A structural survey of the Ashley River Promenade railing. 180 pounds. The exact weight of a man's life when measured by his son-in-law. The report included a marked section where the bolts had been corroded with acid to ensure they would give way under my exact weight. I recognized the architectural notations on the margin, the precise sloping script of someone who had used my own drafting tools to plan my execution. He used my own formulas to calculate my death. I whispered, the paper crinkling under my white-knuckled grip. "Don't ever think your family won't kill you. Sometimes they just haven't seen the right balance sheet yet." The smell of ozone from the computer towers seemed to sharpen as I reached into the back of the drawer frame. My fingers brushed against a small, high-end digital recorder tucked behind the wood. I turned it on, the tiny rhythmic click sounding like a heartbeat in the silence. I heard my own voice from the hospital, but it was wrong. It was heavily edited. My words spliced together to make me sound incoherent and aggressive. Preston had been manufacturing the evidence for my competency hearing, cutting my words until I sounded like a man who had lost his grip on the world. "That's not what I said," I told Milo, my eyes stinging. "He's cutting the words out." I scrolled to the bottom of the digital files and found one dated months before the river. It was titled Trial Run. My heart stopped. This wasn't the first time they tried. Grandpa, the light on the door. Someone's coming. Milo hissed his hand, grabbing my shoulder. The red laser of the security sensor on the doorframe suddenly blinked green, and the heavy thud of a footstep echoed in the hallway right outside. I shoved the recorder into my pocket, the cold sweat prickling at my hairline as the shadow of a man fell across the frosted glass of the office door. Shadows don't just hide secrets, they breathe. And as the floorboard outside the office groaned, I realized the man who wanted my life was only inches away from ending it. The heavy thud of a footstep behind the mahogany door sent a jolt of adrenaline through my age frame. I grabbed Milo by the shoulder, my fingers digging into his thin shirt, and pulled him toward the knee hole of the massive desk. We scrambled into the narrow space, tucking our legs tight against the cold, unyielding wood as the handle turned with a sharp metallic click. The office door swung open, and the room was suddenly filled with the heavy, cloying scent of expensive bourbon and fresh mint. Preston entered the room, the rhythm of his dress shoes on the floor sounding like a countdown. He didn't turn on the overhead lights, relying instead on the blue flickering glow of the computer monitors that reflected off the dark walls like a digital haunting. I held my breath, my lungs burning from the effort as his silhouette hovered directly above our hiding spot. "Don't breathe, Milo," I whispered in a voice so faint it was barely a thought. "Just be a shadow." I could hear the sharp rhythmic thud of what I imagined was Preston's heart, though it was likely just the blood rushing through my own ears. He reached for a mouse, the clicking sound amplified in the absolute silence. Just a few more days. Thane, I heard him mutter to the empty air, his voice a low, growly vibration. Then we can finally balance the books. He checked a single notification on the screen, his fingers tapping a restless beat on the desk surface just inches from my head before turning and leaving as quickly as he had arrived. The door closed and the lock engaged with a finality that left us in darkness. You think you know your family. You think blood is a bond. But in this house, blood was just the ink used to sign my death warrant. Once the sound of his footsteps faded down the hall, I crawled out my hands, trembling. My palm brushed against a hidden latch in the back of the desk drawer, a structural secret I hadn't noticed before. I pressed it and a secondary compartment slid open. Inside was a ghost gallery. I stared at surveillance photos of two other women, Margaret Thornton of Savannah and Susan Whitfield of Atlanta. Taped to the back of the papery death certificates were news clippings of tragic accidents involving water. He didn't just target me. Milo, I whispered, showing him the photos. This is a trophy room. My stomach turned when I saw the final detail. 3 gold wedding rings nestled in a velvet-lined corner of the drawer. He kept them like architectural souvenirs. Grandpa, those ladies, Milo said, his voice small and hollow. They look like they're sleeping in the water. The realization hit me harder than the river had. I wasn't just a victim. I was a project. The third building in a skyline of corpses. I picked up the digital recorder again and realized that the file labeled Trial Run wasn't a rehearsal of my death. It was a recording of Margaret Thornton's final gasping moments. Milo ushered me out of the office, his young face hardened by the horror we had uncovered. We navigated the dark hallway back to the 3rd floor, every creak sounding like an alarm. I collapsed onto my bed, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. Go to bed, Milo. Lock your door. From now on, we play the part he wants. As the first light of dawn touched the window, I heard Preston's voice from the hallway, cheerful and loud, calling me down for breakfast, as if he hadn't just stood over my hiding spot with the soul of a reaper. Looking into the mirror that morning, I didn't see an architect. I saw an actor preparing for the most dangerous opening night of his life, where a single missed cue would mean a permanent curtain call. I deliberately chose mismatched socks and left my top shirt button dangling loose to reinforce the image of a man losing his grip on detail. I practiced a vacant, slightly confused expression in the glass, letting my jaw slacken just enough to look defeated. From below, I heard the cheerful sounds of a family breakfast, Leona humming a soft tune, the distant muffled laughter of Lark. But to my ears, it sounded like a curated stage play designed by a predator, just a confused old man thing. I whispered to my reflection, be the victim they want to see. As I descended the stairs, the vibration of the hall clock ticked like a heart monitor marking each step. I walked into the dining room where the scent of heavy, humid gardenias drifted through the open window, a cloying floral smell that seemed too thick for the morning air. Leona was serving bowls of expensive local berries, their dark juices staining the white porcelain. I realized then that the fruit was laced with the same chemical irritant from the room paint, an overly sweet chemical aftertaste clinging to the edges of the flavor. It was a subtle toxin designed to clear his throat, to induce the very fungus Preston was so eager to document. Preston was seated at the head of the table, his perfectly manicured nails tapping a restless rhythm against the wood as he skimmed a digital paper. He greeted me with a cheerful tone that didn't match the cold thud of the footsteps I had heard outside his office hours earlier. "Did you hear the house settling last night, Thane?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the screen. "I thought I heard footsteps on the second floor around 3. I paused, letting a flicker of faux panic cross my face as I sat down. I had a dream about the River Preston. I think I got up for water, but I couldn't find the kitchen, the stairs. They keep moving on me. Have you ever sat across from your own flesh and blood and watched them wait for you to fail, like vultures circling a dying animal in a $5,000 dining room across from me? Milo sat rigidly, barely touching his food, his eyes fixed on his plate to avoid betraying our shared secret. Preston leaned in, testing me. "Remember we talked about selling your drafting table yesterday? Dad, you agreed it was just taking up space. It was a lie, a fictional conversation from a day that never happened. Did I?" I asked, my voice thin. "Yes, I suppose everything is taking up space lately." I saw the triumphant glint in his eyes. A hunter who believed his prey was finally cornered. He was recording me, every stutter, every staged lapse. I was building his case with every breath. As Preston stood to leave for work, he handed Leona a small digital device I recognized instantly. It was the recorder from the office, and it was already running, capturing my every confused word. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and looked back at me with a look of predatory pity that made my skin crawl. "Don't worry, Thane. We're going to get you the help you need today. Real help." I closed the bedroom door and leaned against it, the staged tremor in my hands finally becoming real as the adrenaline from the dining room began to drain away. The silence of the attic room pressed against my ears like a physical weight broken only by the faint hum of the white noise generator. I walked to the window, pulling the heavy curtain back, just enough to watch Preston's luxury SUV disappear down the driveway. I realized then that the care plan Leona mentioned wasn't just about my health. It included a provision for Preston to begin the immediate liquidation of my firm's intellectual property. "They've built the cage thing," I whispered to the empty room. "Now you have to find the one loose bolt." I immediately began a mental structural inventory of my situation, deconstructing the morning's performance like an architect reviewing a flawed blueprint. I had the evidence from the office, but I was physically isolated on the third floor and legally being boxed in by the cognitive specialist Preston was bringing over. The visual of dust motes dancing in the morning light seemed to mock my confinement. I reached into the secret compartment of my suitcase and pulled out a small velvet pouch. I could still smell the cedar from the trunk where it usually sat. I pulled out my wife Helen's wedding ring, the cool, smooth weight of the golden anchor in my trembling palm. Grief is a heavy stone, but if you hold it right, it becomes a weapon. I turned the band over in my fingers, remembering the 45 years we spent building a life together in Charleston. This ring represented more than love. It was the physical anchor of the integrity Preston was trying to steal from me. "I promised you I'd look after her." "Helen," I muttered, my voice cracking. "But how do I save a daughter who's helping the man holding the knife?" I recalled the values we had instilled in Leona, and the crushing guilt of not seeing Preston's predator nature sooner threatened to overwhelm me. He isn't just taking my money. He's erasing the legacy I spent decades constructing. You never know the true strength of a structure until you try to tear it down. Preston was about to find out exactly how deep my pilings went. I realized that my foundation was still solid, far stronger than the hollow greed he was built upon. I went to put the ring back, but my fingers brushed against something else in the bottom of the velvet pouch. Hidden inside, I found a small handwritten note from Helen written shortly before she died. Don't let our daughter lose her way in the shadows. It read. My heart stopped. She had suspected something about Preston. Even then, a mother's intuition sensing the rot before the architect saw the cracks. I tucked the note away, my eyes hardening with a clarity that the sedative fruit couldn't touch. A building only falls if the foundation is weak. I told the shadows. Mine isn't. I straightened my shirt, the tremor in my hands vanishing as a cold, calculating resolve took its place. The sharp, rhythmic knock on my door wasn't Milo's soft tap. It was the heavy, confident rap of someone who owned the room I was standing in. The metallic click of the latch echoed like a hammer strike, signaling the end of my temporary peace. My daughter didn't enter the room as a child seeking her father. She entered as a surveyor, assessing a condemned building, her eyes tracing the cracks she believed were forming in my mind. The sound of the door hinges groaning as Leona stepped into the space she had helped turn into a prison vibrated through my chest. She was carrying a small tea tray, the porcelain cups rattling a nervous rhythm against the wood. Her voice was a rehearsed clinical kindness that smelled of lavender and antiseptic, a sharp contrast to the genuine warmth she used to possess. Dad, we know you miss Mom, she said, setting the tray down with a practiced softness. But you're seeing things that aren't there. You're scaring the children. As she poured the tea, a manila envelope slipped from her designer bag and landed on the floor. I caught a glimpse of the contents before she snatched it back, glossy photographs of two women I'd never met, smiling at charity galas and yacht clubs. On the back of one photo, I saw a handwritten note in unfamiliar script. They trusted him, too. Leona's face went pale as she shoved the envelope back into her bag. It's nothing, Dad. Just old client files. But her hands were shaking so badly the teacup rattled against the saucer. Someone was warning her, and she was too terrified or too complicit to listen. I sat upright, the note from Helen, still a hot coal in my pocket. I miss her every second. Leona. But grief doesn't make a man hallucinate a hand on his back in the river. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in her eyes, shimmering with a pity that felt like a burial. She began to speak about the strain I had been under since Helen's death in 2020, subtly suggesting that my mourning had evolved into a permanent cognitive break. I realized then that she was merely repeating Preston's carefully crafted talking points, acting as the soft edge of the blade meant to cut me off from my own life. Do you know what it feels like to have your own love for your dead wife used as a lock on your prison door? It is a unique kind of agony to watch your own child weaponize your widowhood. As she poured the tea, the sleeve of her silk blouse slid back, revealing a new diamond-encrusted watch. I recognized the design instantly from the credit card statements I had seen in Preston's office, the glittering blood money from my own retirement account. Leona noticed my gaze and quickly adjusted her sleeve. She brought up a family brunch from 6 months ago that I had supposedly forgotten to attend, using it as proof of my accelerating decline. I realized they had been keeping a meticulous log of every minor mistake I had made while grieving building a case for my incompetence long before the river push. Preston says it's complex bereavement disorder, she whispered. He's just trying to protect your legacy. Is that what we're calling it now? I asked, my voice steady despite the hammer of my pulse. Protecting a legacy by putting the leg in a cage. She was the drywall over the rot, beautiful, seamless, and completely complicit in the structural failure of our family. The grandfather clock in the foyer downstairs ticked a heavy mocking beat that seemed to fill the silence. Leona informed me that a cognitive specialist would arrive within the hour and that I needed to cooperate for everyone's sake. Just tell the doctor the truth. Dad, tell him how tired you are. As she turned to leave, she reached for the velvet pouch containing Helen's ring on the nightstand. I'll keep this safe so you don't misplace it again, she said. I watched her go, my heart hardening into a diamond of resolve. As the door latched, I noticed she had accidentally left behind a printed document on the chair. I picked up the forgotten symptom log, my eyes scanning the notes in Marcus Webb's handwriting. Triggers Helen the firm the river aim for high agitation. The psychological warfare had reached its final phase, and the enemy was already inside the house. The professional brisk footsteps on the porch signaled the arrival of someone who intended to finish what the river had started. But for now I had other ruins to inspect. I pocketed the symptom log, the paper feeling like a cold stone against my thigh, and descended to the kitchen. The room was bright, filled with the cheerful hum of a sub-zero refrigerator and the expensive aroma of dark roast coffee. But as I stood in the doorway, I realized I was looking at a theater of theft where my own daughter was the lead actress. Leona was busy organizing a delivery of artisanal groceries, her movements sharp and jagged. I saw a stack of past due notices for the children's private school tuition hidden inside a heavy French cookbook, the red ink standing out against the white paper like a fresh wound. It seemed the financial collapse was closer than even Preston's office files had suggested. I watched her for a moment, noticing the designer shoes she tried to hide behind the marble island and the new espresso machine that likely cost more than my first car. Her materialism had made her the perfect clay for Preston to mold into a criminal accomplice. That is a lot of groceries for 4 people, Leonie said, my voice, shedding its confused veneer. Pre's fund must be doing better than the news suggests. She jumped her heels, clattering on the polished floor. We just like quality. Dad, don't worry about the receipts. I walked to the quartz countertop, the surface cold and smooth under my fingers. I saw the statements in the office. Leona, $400,000 in credit card debt. Is that why you notarized those papers at the hospital? She froze her face, turning a sickly, translucent pale. You were snooping. How dare you? You are supposed to be resting, not acting like a spy in my own home. She was a structure under immense stress. The load-bearing walls of her conscience, bowing under the weight of a lifestyle she could no longer afford. I abandoned the act entirely, my voice becoming the authoritative architect once again. Do you truly trust him, Leona? Or are you just too afraid of the debt to look him in the eye? My heart broke for her, yet I couldn't ignore the rot. How many dinners can you buy with your father's soul before the taste of the food turns to ash in your mouth? Leona exploded. Then a defensive rant fueled by desperation. You are being paranoid, she screamed, using the very words from Marcus Webb's notes to shield herself from the truth. You're delusional. I am calling Preston. You're clearly having another episode and need to be upstairs. She swept the expensive groceries into the sink with a frantic, destructive energy and stormed out of the room. As she fled, her phone slipped from her pocket and skittered across the marble. It landed face up the screen, flickering to life with a text from Preston. I leaned over my eyes, narrowing as I read. Is the old man quiet yet? Webb says we need the signature by Friday or the house is gone. I stood alone in the sterile brightness of the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator the only sound left. The text on Leona's phone screen flickered out, but the words "or the house is gone" remained burned into my vision. They weren't just killing me for profit, they were killing me for survival. Survival isn't just about outrunning a predator. It's about understanding the architecture of his past kills. And as Milo slipped me a thin, worn envelope in the hallway, I knew the blueprints of my own demise were finally within reach. The sound of the front door latch clicking earlier had signaled Leona's retreat to the garden. But it was the shadow of Milo appearing in the service hallway that brought the real evidence. He stood there, chest heaving, his young face a mask of protective urgency that no child should have to wear. He was going to throw these away. Grandpa Milo whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the house. I saw them in the trash bag in his car. He handed me the envelope, And as I pulled out the first item, a dry cleaning receipt crinkled in my trembling hands. It was for a suit Preston wore the day of my accident, marked with urgent notes about river mud and salt stains. Despite his sworn statement to the police that he had never even touched the water. "You're a brave man, Milo," I said, tucking the paper into my pocket. "Go play in the yard now. Don't let them see you with me." I retreated to a dim corner of the living room, the humid air of the hallway still pressing against my skin like a physical threat. I opened my laptop, the blue light of the screen reflecting in the dark room as I began a targeted search for the names I'd found in his office. Margaret Thornton and Susan Whitfield. Searching for these women was like scrolling through a catalog of ghosts, each one a structural failure in Preston's soul that he'd patched over with stolen cash. The digital obituaries appeared one by one, chilling in their similarity. Margaret had died in a Savannah boating accident in 2015. Susan had drowned in a private pool in Atlanta in 2018. Both were wealthy. Both were recently married to a man using a slightly different alias. But the photos Milo had recovered matched the digital portraits perfectly. Boating accident, private pool, Ashley River. The water is his signature. I whispered to the empty room. My fingers were frantic on the keyboard as I began cross-referencing these dates with what I knew of Preston's financial history. His boutique fund had suffered its first major loss in 2014, just months before Margaret's death. A second massive shortfall hit in 2017, leading directly to Susan's unfortunate accident. If the water always claimed them when the bank accounts ran dry, what did that mean for me? A man whose house was already being measured for its final sale. The current shortfall was $3.1 million. A debt so deep that my own end-of-life timeline had been accelerated to meet a hard Friday deadline. He's not just a killer. He's an actuary of murder. I'm the third quarter dividend. I felt a visceral disgust as I realized I was just a line item on a balance sheet. I scrolled down on Susan Whitfield's page, only to find a final haunting detail. Her obituary mentioned a surviving stepson who had vanished after the inheritance was settled. It was a pattern of total erasure. I was staring at Susan's smiling face on the screen when the sharp rhythmic rattle of the front door handle shattered the silence. The shadow of Preston's frame blocked out the afternoon sun through the frosted glass. And for a second, the world stood perfectly still. The laptop screen felt like a beacon in the dim living room, a glowing confession of my sanity that I had exactly 3 seconds to extinguish before my executioner walked through the door. I heard the heavy front door thudding open, accompanied by the chillingly calm voice of Preston calling out my name. With a sharp click, I slammed the lid shut, the heat radiating from the laptop's underside, pressing against my palm like a brand. I immediately slumped into the armchair, fixing my gaze on a nearby floor lamp, with the vacant, glassy stare I had practiced in the mirror. Preston rounded the corner, his presence filling the room with an air of cold authority. He didn't speak at first. He walked straight to the coffee table and placed his hand on the laptop lid. "The laptop is warmth thing," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I thought you were napping." I let my jaw hang slightly, forcing a dry, sticky feeling into my throat. "I was looking for the blueprints for the St. Jude steeple." I rambled, my voice thin and wavering. "The one with the copper cap." "Do you have the copper, Preston? We need it for the foundation." He looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and a darkening predatory patience. His voice was like sandpaper on a fine mahogany finish, grating, destructive, and determined to strip away every layer of my dignity until nothing but the raw, vulnerable grain remained. "Leona said, you were shouting about money in the kitchen," he said, circling my chair like a wolf. "That's not like you. Thane. It sounds like agitated paranoia." I looked at him, blinking slowly. "Money?" I asked, tilting my head. I was asking about the Gardinas. They smell like the hospital, don't they?" I realized then that he wasn't just guessing. He had a remote access app on that laptop. He had seen my search history into Margaret and Susan in real time. That was why he was home early. He wasn't here to check on me. He was here to accelerate the end. A luxury sedan crunched over the gravel driveway, pulling up to the house an hour ahead of the scheduled appointment. Have you ever seen your own death warrant being pulled out of a stranger's trunk, disguised as a real estate sign? I watched through the window as a man in a charcoal suit unloaded a for sale sign, the sharp metal stakes glinting in the afternoon light. The house was already on the market, and I hadn't even been declared incompetent yet. "The doctor is early," Preston said, his smile sharpening into something lethal. "He's a private consultant recommended by Marcus Webb. He's very thorough. Thane, he'll see right through the foundations." Through the window, I watched as a second man in a navy blazer stepped out of the sedan, pulling a heavy wooden stake from the trunk. It wasn't medical equipment. It was a real estate sign. The polished placard read, "Historic Charleston property coming soon." With a glossy photo of my trad, Preston was already marketing my house, liquidating my life before the ink on the competency papers had even dried. The audacity was breathtaking. He hadn't just planned my death. He'd already spent the inheritance. The signs, metal stakes, glinted in the afternoon sun, like grave markers, a visual countdown to the moment I would be declared legally dead while still breathing. I felt a surge of panic-driven adrenaline. The dry cleaning receipt was still in my pocket, a physical piece of evidence that would destroy me if the consultant searched me. I had to pivot, and I had to do it now. The smell of expensive leather and rain on the consultant's coat seemed to drift into the room even before he entered. Preston's hand clamped onto my elbow with the strength of a vice, pulling me toward the study. "Time for your checkup. Thane, try to be coherent. Your future depends on it." I allowed myself to be led, my mind racing to find a hiding place for the truth, while my body played the part of a crumbling ruin. The study door clicked shut with the finality of a prison bolt, and I found myself staring into the cold, clinical eyes of a man whose job was to dismantle my life with a clipboard. I sat in the high-backed leather chair, the dry smell of old bindings and new printing ink thick in the air, while Preston stood behind me like a warden. I was introduced to Dr. Sterling Hayes, a man who wore his medical degree like a weapon in a suit. That cost more than a year of my pension, watching me with the predatory stillness of a vulture. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my expression to remain slack. As the evaluation began, I noticed Hayes was wearing a high-end watch from Preston's own hedge fund's exclusive merchandise line, a silent admission that he wasn't an independent consultant, but a direct business associate. "Thane, can you tell me what you were looking for on the laptop this afternoon?" he asked, his voice smooth and dangerous. I leaned into my role, letting out a dry, rasping cough. "Blueprints. Old Charleston is built on such shaky pilings. Don't you think?" I whispered, drifting my gaze toward the window. He began a series of standard cognitive tests, but the questions were loaded, specifically designed to trigger the agitated paranoia Marcus Webb had noted in my symptom log. Every time he pressed a button on his tablet, I felt the walls closing in. During a physical coordination test, I had to move my jacket, and the mud-stained dry cleaning receipt Milo had given me nearly slipped from the pocket. I felt a cold jolt of adrenaline as I managed to kick the paper under the heavy mahogany desk just as Hayes leaned in. He wasn't diagnosing me. He was measuring the height of the walls he was building around my remaining days. The cold metal touch of his stethoscope on my chest felt like an invasive probe. "Your eyes are quite bloodshot, thing." He noted, his face inches from mine. "Are you having trouble sleeping in this new house?" I knew what he was looking for. Signs of the chemical sedation. Leona had been slipping into my food. The paint. It has a very specific weight to it. I rambled, letting my eyes wander. "How do you fight a man who is paid to believe you're crazy? You don't. You let him think he's already won." I watched the ticking watch on his wrist, a countdown I couldn't ignore. Preston interrupted us, then his face glowing with a smug, toxic satisfaction as he announced dinner. "The foundations are worse than we thought," Preston Hayes said, standing up and closing his folder with a snap. "He's quite disconnected." "Thank you, Sterling," Preston replied, his hand clamping onto my shoulder again. Let's go eat. We have a lot to discuss about the transition. As we walked toward the hallway, I lagged slightly behind, catching the sharp, hushed whisper Preston directed at Hayes. We need to expedite the medication increase tonight. The words hit me like a physical blow. The poisoning was about to become lethal. The sound of the dining room silver clinking in the distance grew louder, a hollow metallic ringing. I looked at the dinner table gleaming with silver and crystal and realized that for Preston, this wasn't a family meal. It was a Last Supper. Walls in a luxury home are designed to insulate, but no amount of high-grade drywall could dampen the sheer jagged edge of the terror in my daughter's voice. I had avoided the dinner table claiming a sudden bout of exhaustion and instead found myself pressed into the shadows of the darkened hallway near the service pantry. I moved with a careful measured gait, avoiding the sensor zones I had mapped out in my mind. Through the cracked pantry door, I watched as Preston and Leona entered the kitchen after seeing Doctor. Hayes out. The polished facade of the Charleston power couple disintegrated before my eyes. Preston's voice dropped to a low, vibrating growl, a tone I had never heard him use in public, stripped of all hedge fund charm and false empathy. You're getting soft, Leona, he hissed, and I could hear the vibration of the heavy kitchen door closing behind them. I saw your hand shaking when you poured his tea. Preston revealed then that he had been secretly recording Leona's confessions of guilt as insurance, proving he never intended for her to be his partner, but merely his fall guy if the architecture of his lies ever collapsed. He's my father, Preston, she whispered, her voice reflecting in the stainless steel fridge as a distorted, shimmering ghost. He looks so small. Are we really doing this raising a daughter? But he had turned her into a ghost. His anger wasn't an explosion. It was a slow-acting acid eating away at her until there was nothing left but a hollow shell of the girl I used to walk to school. Preston trapped her against the counter, and I heard the sharp, violent clink of a glass being slammed onto the quartz. He reminded her of the dangerous people expecting their money by Friday, and how her name was on every fraudulent withdrawal from my accounts. He framed my death as her only path to staying out of prison and keeping her children. If we stop now, the bank takes the house on Monday, and the SEC takes me on Tuesday. He said, where do you think that leaves you and the kids? How do you save someone who is holding the very hand that's strangling them? Please, she begged her spirit, visibly snapping, don't hurt him anymore. Just let the doctor handle the papers. Preston merely laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. He mentioned a boating trip for the weekend, the same method he used to kill Margaret Thornton, and I realized my execution date was set for the next 48 hours. I felt a surge of paternal protective rage, realizing I had to destroy my own daughter's marriage to save her life from this actuary of murder. I watched her through the gap as she collapsed into a chair, her shoulders heaving with silent, broken sobs that smelled of cold coffee and floor wax. She was a hostage to her own vanity and his malice. The sharp, rhythmic whistling of Preston began as he walked away, a tune I recognized with a shiver from Helen's funeral. The sound of Leona's spirit breaking was quieter than I expected, but as Preston's footsteps faded, I knew the clock hadn't just started. It was about to strike midnight. I remained in the dark, my heart a heavy stone of resolve, knowing the river was calling for me once again. The soft creak of the studio door and the smell of oil paints and despair followed me as I stepped into my daughter's private sanctuary. Walking into Leona's studio was like stepping into a cathedral of denial, where every swatch of silk and marbled tile was a prayer meant to drown out the sound of her own conscience. I found her frantically rearranging mood boards, her movements jerky and desperate, as if she were trying to physically reorder a world that was falling apart. I realized then that she hadn't just been spending the money. She'd been funneled into a silent partnership in a shell company that Marcus Webb used for money laundering, a deeper rot than I had ever imagined. I chose to abandon the agitated persona Preston expected. I know you're in there, Leona, I said, my voice cutting through the clinical silence. Not the designer, not the accomplice, my daughter. She flinched her hands, clutching a fabric swatch as if it were a life preserver. Dad, please. Preston said you'd get like this. You need your medicine. I ignored the tea tray and the luxury finishes of the room, the granite and gold that served as the walls of her own prison. I know about the $250,000 debt you personally signed for, and the forgery at the hospital. I was trying to shore up a load-bearing wall that had already been turned to sawdust by termites of her own making. Grace isn't about what you deserve. Leona, it's about what you choose to protect now. Help me save Milo and Lark, and I will forgive it all. I will protect you from the police, but only if you help me expose him. It's too late. She whispered, the wet, gasping sound of her breath filling the space between us. The papers are already filed. I'm part of it. Dad. I'm the one who signed. The mirror didn't lie. She saw a criminal. I saw my little girl drowning in a sea of gold-plated lies. She caught her own reflection in a large silver-framed mirror and recoiled, the distortion of her face in the polished surface matching the ruin in her heart. Could you truly forgive a mistake this big? She asked, her voice a fragile red. I already have, I replied, my heart breaking for the legacy we had lost. But the law won't. I stood among her expensive samples, a silent witness to her collapse. She didn't choose the light. She chose the fear. Leona fled the studio, sobbing into her hands, leaving me alone with the rhythmic ticking of the minimalist studio clock. As she ran out, a single document fluttered from her desk and landed at my feet. I picked up the paper, expecting another bill or a design spec, but it was an itinerary for a boating trip. My eyes locked onto the time printed in bold 5 p.m. Not this weekend. Today. The realization hit me with the force of a structural collapse. I looked at the studio clock. It was already 9. I had less than 8 hours to live. Preston had planned the boating trip as his primary execution method, the same technique he'd used on Margaret Thornton. But the moment we arrived at the precinct, he knew the timeline had collapsed. The GPS tracker in Helen's ring betrayed our location, forcing him to abandon the slow, calculated drowning for something more desperate. Hostages. The children weren't part of his original plan. They were his emergency exit strategy. When the architecture of his lies began to crumble, the silent house around me no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a tomb being sealed in real time. I had to move. And I had to move now before the tide of Preston's final plan washed over the last of my family's foundations. 8 hours left to live. And my survival was currently hanging on a piece of plastic the size of my thumbnail and the courage of a boy who shouldn't have to know how to hide evidence from his own father. I was alone in the studio, the rhythmic ticking of the clock feeling like a hammer against my skull when I heard the frantic hollow sound of Milo's sneakers on the wood. He slipped into the room breathless and pale, his small hands trembling as he reached into his pocket. He handed me a ruggedized USB drive. I found it, Grandpa. He whispered, the smell of damp drywall and dust clinging to his hair. It was inside a hollowed-out book in the office. The emails. They have been planning the boating excursion since before the river. I felt a surge of protective love for the boy mixed with a calculated cold rage. You did well, Milo. Now listen, if they take me today, you have to find a way to get this to Jim Rodriguez. I pulled my hidden tablet from my drafting kit, the blue flickering of the screen illuminating the shadows as I scanned the drive's contents. My lungs tightened as I scrolled through legal drafts by Marcus Webb. It wasn't just malpractice. The drive revealed that Marcus Webb is actually Preston's biological brother, making this a predatory family conspiracy. They had outlined a systematic looting of my architectural legacy, including a fraudulent contract to sell my firm to an offshore entity. The emails confirmed that Preston intended to satisfy a high-interest debt to investors using my death. It is a systematic dismantling, I muttered. They have already spent my life twice over. How many gigabytes of data does it take to document the betrayal of a father? Not many. It turns out, I heard the vibration of the SUV in the driveway and the crunch of gravel under tires. I knew I couldn't keep the drive on me during the evaluation or the trip. I looked at the structural metal beam in the studio wall. Quick, Milo, under the load-bearing header. I hissed, They will never check the structure. With Milo's help, I secured the drive behind the beam using a magnetic strip. The flash drive felt like a live grenade in my pocket, destructive enough to level Preston's empire, but only if I could survive long enough to pull the pin. As I stepped back, I saw a final notification on the tablet that made my blood freeze. Preston had installed a GPS tracker inside my wedding ring, the very ring Leona had taken for safekeeping earlier. They weren't just watching my mind, they were tracking my every move through the one anchor I had left of Helen. The house was no longer a home. It was a sensory-mapped cage where even my sentiment was a weapon against me. I tried to shut down the tablet, my fingers fumbling against the glass as footsteps approached the door. The handle of the studio door turned the heavy mahogany, groaning in protest as if trying to warn me, and I realized I was still holding the tablet in plain sight. The hall light began to spill into the room, a widening wedge of white that threatened to expose the last of my secrets. I shoved the device under a pile of silk swatches, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and turned to face the door just as the latch clicked open. I shoved the tablet beneath a stack of old blueprints, a heartbeat before the door slammed open, my pulse hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird sensing the cat's shadow. Preston entered the studio, his tailored silhouette blocking out the hall light. His eyes, cold and restless, immediately began a surgical scan of the room looking for Milo or any misplaced thread of evidence. "You're wandering again. Thane," he said, his voice carrying that smooth hedge fund arrogance I had grown to loathe. "This isn't your room." I let my mouth hang open slightly, assuming the vacant mask of the drifting elder. "The headers?" Clear's throat. "They're steel, aren't they?" I rambled, gesturing toward the structural beam where the USB drive was hidden. "Good for the weight. Very good for the weight," he sneered, checking the temperature of the air as if he could sense my panic. Just then, my phone, which Milo had miraculously recharged in secret, vibrated in my pocket. I realized then that Detective Morrison wasn't just calling about the railing. Jim Rodriguez had actually filmed the push on his phone, but was too afraid to come forward until he saw Preston's SUV again. The phone's vibration felt like a lightning strike in a room made of dry timber, dangerous, unexpected, and the only thing that could clear the air. I pulled it out with cold, slick fingers and answered, "Mr. Garrison, this is Detective Morrison. We found traces of acid on the bolts. We need to talk." Detective Morrison's voice was like seasoned oak, rough solid, and carrying the weight of 20 years of Charleston's darkest secrets. My heart leaped, but I saw Preston stepping toward the doorway, leaning against the frame to listen. Yes, I remember the water. I croaked, keeping my tone vague and confused. It was so cold. Have you ever held a conversation knowing that every word you spoke was a brick being laid in the wall of your own defense? I could feel Preston's predatory gaze on my back of physical pressure. I knew I had to schedule a meeting without alerting him to the fact that I was fully sane. "Tomorrow at 9 o'clock, I asked the detective, making it sound like I was talking to an architect. "Yes, the blueprints. I'll be there." I hung up my hand, trembling as I turned to face my son-in-law. "Who was that thing?" Preston asked, his voice a low, vibrating threat. "You shouldn't be taking calls alone. Just a man asking about the blueprints." I replied, staring past him. He said the railing was broken. I saw then what he was carrying in his left hand, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. The smell of metal and lubricant from the tool filled the small space, a sharp industrial scent that signaled his intent to destroy any remaining structural evidence, or perhaps to silence the man who knew too much. He didn't say another word, but he slowly tapped the steel jaws of the bolt cutters against the doorframe, the rhythmic clack sounding like a judge's gavel. His eyes promised that I would never make it to that 9 o'clock appointment. The shadow of his frame stretched across the floor, reaching for me like a dark tide. I stood my ground, the cold sweat slicking my phone's casing, knowing the final structural failure of our family was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. Reading the truth about how my daughter was hunted wasn't like reading a diary. It was like reviewing the structural stress tests of a building designed specifically to collapse with her inside. I retreated to the dimmest corner of my attic room, the blue light of the tablet searing into my tired eyes as the cooling fan whirred a frantic mechanical prayer. I opened the file titled Project L on the flash drive, which Milo had recovered from the office. It was a terrifyingly detailed timeline starting from 2019 documenting Leona's deepest insecurities, her favorite luxury brands, and the raw, jagged edges of her grief over Helen. Preston had noted exactly when to provide emotional support and exactly when to introduce the seductive lure of offshore investments. Every romantic milestone in their marriage was a calculated financial maneuver. Target demonstrates high attachment to status symbols. I read the words. A cold grease on my palm. Use debt to ensure compliance. He wasn't her husband. He was her warden. His words were like termites in the beams of our family tree. Quiet, invisible, and dedicated to turning our history into dust. I discovered that Preston was actually the anonymous tipster who reported my architectural firm for a minor building code violation in 2020. He had done it specifically to create the first seed of confusion in my professional record, a crack in the foundation he intended to widen. The journal detailed his efforts to isolate Leona from her old friends and from me, manufacturing misunderstandings and forgotten phone calls to make her believe I was losing my mind years before the river incident. He made her choose between her vanity and her father, and he made sure vanity won every time. The nauseating smell of the chemical paint in the small room seemed to thicken with every sentence I scrolled through. The last entries detailed the Thing Garrison liquidation. Preston had calculated the exact date his hedge fund's debt would go public and set my accidental death for 3 days prior. How do you breathe when you realize the man tucking your grandchildren into bed is the same man who has already priced their silence? The journal ended with a chilling one-line entry about Milo and Lark suggesting they would be sent to a boarding facility in Marcus Webb's name once the insurance cleared. He was going to sell my grandchildren to pay for his mistakes. The vibration of my own heart thudded in my ears as I reached the final digital folder. It contained a copy of a letter Preston wrote to be found after my death, a forged suicide note that blamed my unbearable dementia for my choice to end my life in the river. It was a perfect mimicry of my signature, a final professional insult from a predator who saw people as mere building materials. I felt physically ill, a cold sweat slicking my skin as I realized the systematic nature of his grooming. I wasn't just a victim. I was a line item being crossed off. I stared at the forged suicide note on the screen, my own signature perfectly mimicked at the bottom. And then I heard the heavy, deliberate tread of Preston's shoes stopping directly outside my door. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, a shadow against the threshold, and I knew the blueprints for the final confrontation were already in his hand. The gray, soupy light of a Charleston dawn crept through the attic window, and the sound of a zipper on a duffel bag downstairs signaled that the final phase had begun. I shoved the tablet deep into my waistband, the cold metal, a sharp reminder of the evidence I carried. Preston ushered me to the SUV with high-spirited energy that made my skin crawl. He was talking about the boating trip as if it were a reward for my recovery rather than a planned execution. Leona stood by the driver's side, her hands gripping the door handle so hard her knuckles were white. Preston leaned in, his voice full of that hollow practice charm. Drive safely. Make sure Dad stays comfortable. I'll meet you at the marina in 20. I have him, Preston. Just go, she whispered, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. I noticed then that she had already packed a run bag for herself and the kids weeks ago, hidden beneath a spare tire cover, proving she had been subconsciously preparing for Preston's turn toward violence. The smell of leather and expensive perfume in the SUV was suffocating. As we pulled out of the driveway, I watched Preston in the rearview mirror, standing with Marcus Webb as they watched us depart. For a few miles, the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of the turn signal. Then, as the vibration of the Ravenel Bridge began to thrum through the tires, I dropped the mask. I know about the note. Leona, I said, my voice steady and clear. He wrote a suicide note in my handwriting. He was never going to let you keep the children. She gasped, nearly swerving into the next lane as the sun reflected off the harbor water with a blinding glare. The Rabbinal Bridge felt like a tightrope stretched over an abyss. And Leona was the one swaying in the wind, while I held the only safety line left. "Daddy, I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her frantic, shallow breathing filling the cabin. I thought it was just the money. I saw the kerosene receipt, but I was too scared. I reached out and put my hand over hers on the steering wheel. "Grace isn't about what you deserve, Leona. It's about what you choose to protect now. He has a GPS tracker in my wedding ring. He's watching us right now." What is the sound of a lifelong lie finally snapping? It's quieter than you'd think. It sounds like a turn signal clicking in the dark. As we reached the end of the bridge, her phone buzzed with a text from Preston, but she didn't look at it. "Turn the wheel. Leona," I commanded. "End this structure before it kills us all." With a violent yank, she steered the SUV toward the downtown precinct exit. "Tell them everything," she whispered, "even the parts that send me to jail." As we pulled into the police station parking lot, I felt a surge of grim relief. Jim Rodriguez's truck was already parked near the entrance, indicating the swimmer had arrived to deliver the video evidence of the push. Leona killed the engine and rested her forehead against the wheel, her body shaking with the weight of her choice. "He's going to kill me for this, isn't he?" she asked, her voice a hollow whisper that broke the last of my heart. But before I could answer, my phone vibrated with a violence that made my entire body jolt. The unknown number flashed across the cracked screen. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but something an architect's instinct for structural failure made me answer. The voice that filled my ear wasn't Preston's smooth hedge fund charm. It was the raw, stripped-down sound of a man whose empire was collapsing in real time, and he was looking for someone to bury in the rubble. "Hello, Thane Preston," said his voice, a low, vibrating threat that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I hear you've been having conversations with people who don't understand our family's business." The cold, metallic taste of fear flooded my mouth as I realized he knew we were at the precinct. The GPS tracker in Helen's wedding ring had betrayed us. I could hear the rhythmic sound of traffic in the background, the distinctive whoosh of Highway 17, and I knew he wasn't at the marina. He was mobile hunting. "Preston," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the hammer of my pulse. "If you're calling to apologize for the river, you're a few weeks late." His laugh was a dry, rattling sound that carried no humor. "Apologize? No thing. I'm calling to give you a choice. You can stop this investigation, or you can keep playing detective, and we'll see how well you swim when the current is twice as strong." The threat was clear, but it was the background noise that made my blood freeze. I heard a child's voice, Lark's high-pitched giggle, and the distinctive electronic chime of a school bell. "Where are you, Preston?" I demanded, my voice rising. His silence was a physical weight pressing against my chest. "I'm exactly where I need to be. Thane, just remember, foundations crumble faster when you remove the wrong support beam. Think about which beams you're willing to lose." The line went dead, leaving only the hollow echo of his threat hanging in the air. I looked at Leona, her face drained of color. "He's at the school," I whispered. "He's taking the children." We burst through the precinct doors, Leona screaming for Detective Morrison. As I recounted the call, the smell of jasmine from the garden outside mixed with the acrid taste of adrenaline as Morrison immediately radioed dispatch. The call wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of war, and the battlefield was about to expand beyond anything I had anticipated. As sirens began to wail in the distance, I knew the structure of our family was about to face its final stress test. The smell of the precinct was a mixture of floor wax and stale coffee, a sterile scent that felt like the first breath of clean air I'd taken since the river had tried to claim me. I walked through the heavy glass doors with Leona, the cold air-conditioned draft in the interview room, raising the hair on my arms. Detective Morrison greeted us in a windowless space, his face set in a grim mask. I didn't waste time on tears. I started with structural proof. I laid out the dry cleaning receipt with its telltale river silt and the symptom log containing Marcus Webb's handwritten triggers. Morrison revealed that Jim Rodriguez's video didn't just show the push. It showed Preston returning to the railing 10 minutes later with a vial of acid to finish dissolving the bolts. "I'm an architect, detective. I know how to read a failure," I said, my voice finally steady. "This railing didn't rust. It was assassinated." Morrison nodded slowly, the scratch of his pen on his legal pad, the only other sound. "You've brought me a lot more than just a bad memory, Mr. Garrison." I reached into my pocket and produced the ruggedized flash drive. The metallic smell of the evidence bag felt like victory as I handed it over. I explained the email chain between Preston and Marcus Webb, the liquidation timeline, and the horrific predator's journal. As the drive was plugged into a workstation, a blue flickering light from the monitor washed over us. Laying out the evidence was like placing the final stones in a dam. I could feel the current of Preston's lies finally starting to slow against the weight of the truth. The room went silent as Morrison scrolled through the cold, tabulated plans for my death. "It's all here," I whispered. "The life insurance, the shell companies, and the previous victims." "My God," Morrison muttered. "He has a spreadsheet for the probate period. A tech specialist with a buzzed haircut and eyes that move faster than the data on his screen." Agent Miller took the drive with a pair of sterile tweezers. He began verifying the digital signatures on the forged power of attorney while the hum of the precinct server fans filled the gaps in our conversation. I pulled out my tablet and showed the GPS tracker notification. "If the ring is in this building, Preston knows we're here." I warned, "We need to shield that signal." Now Morrison barked an order to Miller, who moved with sudden frantic energy to isolate the device. "How does it feel to see your own life being sold off in a dark web auction while you're still sitting in a room with the heat on Agent Miller's fingers flew across the keys?" He discovered a hidden partition on the flash drive containing live stream credentials for cameras in the Mount Pleasant house. Preston wasn't just watching me. He was broadcasting my perceived decline to a private bidding group of predatory lenders. Morrison stared at the live camera feed from my bedroom in Mount Pleasant, his face draining of color. My heart stopped as he checked another screen, one tracking the movement of Preston's own vehicle. "If he's not tracking you," he whispered, looking up at me with eyes full of a new sharp panic. "Why is he at the school? There is no architectural filter for a father watching his only child dismantle her own life sentence by sentence through the cold transparency of a two-way mirror." I stood in the darkened observation room, the cold, oily feel of the observation glass pressing against my forehead. On the other side of the partition, the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead LED panels washed the color from Leona's face, making her look like a ghost in her own story. Detective Morrison pivoted with clinical precision, shifting from my ally to her interrogator. I watched her trembling hands reach for a plastic cup of water, her smudged mascara tracing paths of ruin down her cheeks. Leona revealed then that she had secretly recorded one of Preston's phone calls with Marcus Webb, where they discussed the final solution for me. She had evidence of the murder plot, a digital recording that could have saved me weeks ago, but she had chosen to hide it out of a paralyzing fear for her own safety. "I just wanted the house back. Detective." She whispered, her voice a muffled, echoing quality over the intercom. "Preston said it was just a temporary loan from Dad's estate." Morrison didn't blink. "A $250,000 loan without clear's throat. His consent is called grand larceny Leona." The glass between us was more than just silica and lead. It was the physical manifestation of 40 years of trust being ground into sand. I watched her break down completely when Morrison slid the power of attorney document across the table. She admitted she knew it wasn't my signature, but she had been convinced by Marcus that it was a legal necessity to protect us from bankruptcy. Preston hadn't just used her greed. He had used her terror of failure to turn her into a criminal. "I didn't know about the river," she wailed, her voice cracking under the scent of ozone from the recording equipment. "I swear on my children's lives, I thought he just fell. But you didn't tell the doctors the truth when he tried to speak. Did you?" Morrison countered. She couldn't answer. She simply stared at the table. A structure collapsed under its own weight. How do you hold the hand of someone who used your own signature to write your obituary? I wanted to reach through the glass to pull her back to the girl who used to sit on my drafting stool, but that girl was gone. Morrison informed her that while her cooperation would be noted, her actions made her a co-conspirator. The realization of a prison sentence finally hit her, and she looked toward the glass, instinctively, knowing I was there. "Daddy, are you there? Please." Her eyes were pleading for a structural rescue I could no longer provide. As she was being led out by a uniformed officer, she stopped at the door, whispering one last detail to Morrison. "Preston has a second untraceable vehicle hidden in a rental lot for emergencies," she said, her voice hollow. "He's going to use it today." Leona's eyes locked onto mine through the one-way glass. And in that moment, the daughter I knew vanished, replaced by a woman who realized that her perfect life was actually a prison she had helped build. I remained in the dark, my heart a heavy stone of paternal sorrow. As the weight of her complicity settled over the room like a shroud, the daughter I had built my world around was now a stranger facing the ruins of her own making. The heavy thud of the door closing behind Leona left a hollow ringing in my ears, soon replaced by the frantic crackle of Morrison's radio. It was a high-priority alert from the school district, a sound that turned my exhausted justice into a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. I stood in the precinct command center, the sharp, stinging smell of fresh printer ink from the newly issued warrants clinging to the air. Detective Morrison's face was grim as he signed the official papers for Preston Ward and Marcus Webb. "It's done. Thane," he said, his voice barely audible over the overlapping barks of police radios. "We have enough for attempted murder and conspiracy." I looked at the ink still glistening on the page. "Just make sure he doesn't see the strike team coming," I warned. "He's a structural thinker. He'll look for the exits before you even reach the driveway." The machinery of justice was finally pivoting, but the structural integrity of my relief collapsed when the desk phone rang. It was the principal of the Children's Academy. Her voice was thin and panicked as she reported that Preston had arrived 20 minutes ago, claiming I had suffered a massive stroke. He told them he needed to take Milo and Lark to the hospital immediately because Leona had authorized him as the sole decision-maker for school pickups. Just 2 days after the river incident, they had released my grandchildren into his hands without a single question. "He took them?" I shouted, the cold sweat dripping down my neck. "But I'm standing right here." "Mr. Garrison, stay calm," Morrison said, though his own jaw was tight. "We're tracking his vehicle now. The warrants were just paper walls, and Preston had just driven a wrecking ball through the middle of them. I discovered then that the passports were missing from the home safe. He had been planning this escape contingency for weeks." Before I explain what the stationary GPS signal truly means, I'd love to get your honest feedback. We've been through a lot of twists and turns to get to this point. How would you rate the quality of this story so far on a scale of 1 to 10? Please drop your rating in the comments. Your feedback is the only way I can keep improving these stories for you. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes, as the message is what I hope stays with you. If this dramatization isn't for you, feel free to stop here. The command center fell into a localized heavy silence as the tech specialist pointed to the monitors. The GPS tracker in the wedding ring showed the vehicle was stationary at a downtown mall. Preston had dumped the anchor. He wasn't running for the state line yet. He was repositioning. Do you know the exact temperature of fear? It's the ice water flash that hits your spine when you realize your grandchildren are in the hands of a man who sees them as bargaining chips. "He's not running. Detective," I whispered, my voice cracking. "He's taking hostages. He's using my own flesh and blood as a structural shield." The precinct's televisions all flickered simultaneously to the emergency broadcast, a synchronized pulse of light that made the room feel smaller. There, beneath the bold red letters of the Amber Alert, were the smiling school photos of Milo and Lark. I stared at their faces, the silence of the command center becoming absolute as every officer held their breath, realizing the man we were hunting had just turned the children into his final exit strategy. The flickering fluorescent lights of the precinct felt like a strobe effect, freezing my daughter's face in a jagged sequence of screams that no amount of luxury or lies could ever silence again. Leona collapsed in the middle of the squad room, her high-heeled boots slipping on the linoleum as she screamed for her children with raw, rhythmic sobbing that tore through the clinical quiet. "I gave them to him!" She shrieked, her voice a whirlwind of grief and self-loathing. "I signed the papers that let him take them." Detective Morrison moved to restrain her, his face a grim mask. "Lona, look at me!" he barked, voice cutting through hysteria. "We need the plate number of that rental car. Focus." I watched from the sidelines, realizing my daughter was finally broken. But the cost of her clarity was the very lives of my grandchildren. The precinct doors slid open and a bike courier in sweat-stained spandex entered. Looking confused by the chaos, he had a package addressed to the architect. Morrison intercepted it inside. Wrapped in a blueprint of the Mount Pleasant estate was Milo's digital watch screen, smashed and frozen at 300 p.m. The sharp metallic scent of blood on the watch glass hit my nostrils. He sent this to taunt me. I whispered, heart thudding. As Morrison tilted the watch, I saw a tiny bloody fingerprint. It wasn't from Milo. The size was wrong. It was from Lark. My brave little girl had fought back, but it was the soft electronic chime of an iPad notification that cut through the noise like a bell in a cathedral. Agent Miller's head snapped up from his workstation eyes, widening as he stared at tracking software. "We've got something," he said, voice sharp with urgency. "It's coming from a cellular-enabled iPad registered to Emma Ward." The room fell silent except for server hum and distant police radios. I pushed through the cluster of officers, heart hammering as I leaned over Miller's shoulder. "What does it say?" Miller's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the notification. It wasn't a standard message. It was a location pin dropped in the Find My Friends app, the kind of breadcrumb a smart child would leave when she knew her phone had been taken. Attached was a single line of text typed with careful precision. Blue Heron Motel, Highway 17 North, Room 14. The message was time-stamped 3 minutes ago, and below was a second line that made my blood run cold. "Grandpa, he has a knife. Please hurry. That's my girl," I whispered, voice breaking with pride and terror. "She's telling us where they are." Morrison was already on his radio barking orders. "All units, we have a confirmed location. Blue Heron Motel, Highway 17, North Room 14. Suspect is armed with a blade holding 2 juvenile hostages. Code 3 response, but maintain perimeter. No sirens within half-mile. I need SWAT mobilized now." The room exploded into motion, but I stood frozen. The Blue Heron Motel was a relic from Charleston's past, a 2-story roadside motel on the edge of condemnation. I knew it well. My firm had assessed its structural integrity in the 90s. The building was a death trap of rotting wood and failing supports, and Preston had chosen it for exactly that reason. "How long until SWAT arrives?" I asked. Miller checked his screen. 12 minutes. "Sir, maybe 15 with traffic." 12 minutes was an eternity for 2 children trapped with a man willing to kill. I looked at Morrison, resolve hardening. "I'm going with you, and I'm going in first." Morrison opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. "He knows me. Detective. If you send in a badge, he'll panic. But if I walk through that door, he'll think he still has control." Morrison stared at me, then nodded. "You wear a vest and you follow my lead. The second I give the signal, you drop to the floor." "Understood." As we rushed toward the parking lot, I looked at Emma's message one more time. She had given me the blueprint. Now I had to execute the rescue. The Blue Heron Motel wasn't a landmark. It was a tombstone marking the death of Charleston's roadside glory, a 2-story relic with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that buzzed like a dying insect. As Morrison's cruiser skidded into the gravel parking lot, the smell of hot asphalt and stale exhaust mixed with salt breeze from the marsh beyond. I stepped out the bulletproof vest they'd forced me into, feeling like a cage, and stared up at the second-floor walkway where room 14 sat like a dark, unblinking eye. The motel was structural decay, incarnate rusted railings, cracked concrete windows covered with sun-bleached curtains. It was exactly where a desperate man would make his final stand. SWAT had established a perimeter, black-clad forms moving like shadows as they positioned behind vehicles and along the exterior stairwell. Morrison gripped my shoulder. He's in room 14, second floor, northeast corner. Curtains drawn, no movement but thermal shows. 3 signatures, 2 small, 1 adult. Relief that my grandchildren were alive was crushed by knowledge of what Preston could do when cornered. How do you negotiate with a man who sees humans as line items on a balance sheet? Morrison's radio crackled. All units in position. Snipers on adjacent building have a clear line to the window, but can't get a shot without risking the children. Recommend contact and negotiation. Morrison turned to me. This is your play. Thane. Walk up. Knock. Keep him talking. The second he lowers that knife or moves from the kids, we breach. But if he makes a move, you hit the floor. I adjusted the vest, feeling the concealed wire taped to my chest. The microphone was cold against my skin, a reminder that every word would be heard by officers waiting for their cue. I began the long walk across the parking lot, footsteps crunching on gravel. The afternoon sun was brutal, reflecting off metal railings. As I climbed the stairs, each step groaned. I noticed cigarette butts crushed in corners, a child's toy near room 12, the smell of mildew, and cheap disinfectant. When I reached the walkway, I saw the door faded teal paint, tarnished brass number hanging askew. I paused, hand hovering, and took a breath. A television filtered through the walls, news discussing the Amber Alert with my grandchildren's faces. Preston. I called out, voice steady despite adrenaline. It's Thing. I'm alone. No police. No weapons. I just want to talk. Silence was a living weight suffocating. Then the metallic click of a deadbolt withdrawing, and the door cracked open. Preston's face appeared in the gap, and I barely recognized him. The expensive running gear was gone, replaced by a rumpled shirt stained with sweat. His eyes were bloodshot and wild. The polished manager stripped away to reveal a hollow shell. You shouldn't have come. Thane, he whispered. This could have ended cleanly. Now you're making it worse. Behind him, I glimpsed Milo and Lark, huddled on the far bed faces, pale with terror. The structural walls of my resolve solidified as I looked into my grandchildren's eyes and knew that whatever happened next, I would not let this man take them from me. The motel room was a capsule of desperation, air thick with stale cigarettes and fear. I stepped across the threshold, eyes locking onto Milo and Lark on the far bed. They were alive. But terror in their eyes was a knife twisting in my chest. Preston closed the door with a soft click, the deadbolt sliding home with finality. The room was exactly what I'd expected. 2 sagging beds with faded floral bedspreads, a battered nightstand, a small table near the window where Preston had set up his command center. His laptop displayed live news coverage, and beside it lay a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade gleaming under fluorescent light. Don't move, Grandpa Milo whispered. He has the knife. I raised my hand slowly, palms out. I could feel the wire pressing against my chest microphone, picking up every word from Morrison's team outside. I'm not here to fight you, Preston. I'm here because you called me to the river once and now I'm calling you back to dry ground. Preston's laugh was bitter and hollow. Doesn't have to end thing. It already ended. The fund is gone. Marcus is gone. Leona's testimony destroyed everything. All I have left is leverage. He gestured toward the children with the knife blade catching light sickeningly. I took a careful step closer, positioning myself between Preston and the kids. The floor creaked, a reminder that this structure, both building and situation, was on the verge of collapse. You think they're leverage? I kept my tone conversational. Preston, they're your stepchildren. You tucked them in, went to their school plays. Somewhere you must have felt something. His face twisted. I felt bored. Thing like I was babysitting someone else's mistakes while waiting for the payout. Do you know what it's like to smile at a child when all you see is a decimal point? The casual cruelty hit like a physical blow, but I stayed calm. I needed him talking, giving SWAT time to position. Through the curtain gap, I caught a glimpse of a black-clad figure on the exterior walkway. They were getting into position, but the room's layout made a clean shot impossible. Preston stood too close to the window. You're right, Preston. I underestimated you. Margaret, Susan, even me. You're a builder like I am. You just build with different materials. His eyes narrowed. What are you saying? I'm saying you win. You want leverage? Take me. Let the kids go and I'll be your hostage. I'm worth more alive. I'll sign whatever you want. Just let them walk out. For a moment, calculation flickered across his face, but then Milo spoke, young voice cutting through tension. Don't listen to him. Preston, Grandpa's wired. The cops are right outside. My blood turned to ice as Preston's gaze snapped to my chest, eyes widening. The boy had just thrown a grenade into the negotiation. Preston's face contorted with rage as he lunged, knife raised, and the careful architecture of the standoff collapsed into chaos. Outside, Morrison's voice crackled over megaphone. Preston Ward. This is Charleston Police. Release the hostages and surrender. You are surrounded. Boots thundered up the exterior stairs and I realized the breach was coming whether we were ready or not. The fluorescent light flickered, casting jagged shadows, and I saw Preston's eyes lock onto mine with terrible clarity. He wasn't going to surrender. He was going to take as many down as he could. Time didn't slow. It fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. Preston's lunge was a blur, the hunting knife arcing through stale air with lethal intent. I threw myself backwards, shoulder slamming into the cheap dresser as the blade whistled past my face close enough that I felt air displacement. Behind me, Lark screamed high and piercing, freezing Preston for a heartbeat. That moment was all Milo needed. The boy launched from the bed, colliding with Preston's legs in a desperate tackle that sent him stumbling. The knife clattered across the floor, skittering under the bed, and I heard the most beautiful sound, the splintering crack of the door being blown off its hinges. Breach, breach, breach. SWAT flooded in like a black tide, boots thundering. Flash grenades detonated with blinding light and concussive blasts that rattled my teeth. I dropped to the floor, covering my head as the world became chaos. Shouted commands in acrid smoke. Get down. Get on the ground. Hands where we can see them. Preston's scream of rage cut short as officers tackled him, their weight driving him into carpet. Zip ties ratcheted tight. Then Morrison's voice. Secure the suspect. Get the children out. Clear the room. Strong hands pulled me up, guiding me toward the door. Through smoke, I saw Milo and Lark being carried out by officers wrapped in protective arms. Grandpa Lark's voice cut through noise. I'm here, sweetheart. I called, voice breaking. You're safe now. As I was led onto the walkway, afternoon sun hit like a physical blow. The parking lot was a sea of flashing lights, patrol cars, ambulances, fire trucks converging on this roadside pocket where our darkest chapter had reached its conclusion. Behind me, Preston's voice raw and stripped. You don't understand, he screamed as they dragged him out. I needed that money. The fund was collapsing. I had no choice. Morrison appeared at my side, hand gripping my shoulder. You had a choice. Preston, you chose to be a predator. Now you live with consequences. As Preston was hauled downstairs, I caught one last glimpse of his face. The polished manager, the charming son-in-law, the man who'd stood at my daughter's wedding. All gone. What remained was hollow shell, a structure rotten from the foundation up. Medics swarmed Milo and Lark while I stood on the walkway, legs weak. Morrison guided me to sit on the top step, metal railing cool under my palm. You did good. Thane, you kept him talking long enough for us to position. If you hadn't walked through that door, this could have ended differently. I looked down at the parking lot where Preston was being loaded into a patrol car, handcuffed. The hunting knife had been bagged as evidence, blade still gleaming. I thought about Margaret and Susan, names reduced to line items. I thought about the river and the push. And I thought about 2 children in the ambulance alive, because a 12-year-old had been brave enough to tackle a monster. Leona arrived moments later, car screeching to a halt at the perimeter. She ran toward the ambulance face, a mask of anguish and relief as she gathered Milo and Lark into her arms. I watched as she collapsed to her knees, sobbing into their hair, and I knew that whatever trials awaited her, this reunion was the first honest thing she'd done in years. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, I made my way down the stairs. Each step felt heavy, the weight of everything pressing down, but when I reached the bottom and felt solid ground beneath my feet, I realized I was still standing. The structure of my life had been tested, cracked, nearly destroyed, but the foundation had held. They say justice is blind, but as I walked into that courtroom, I realized she was also cold, efficient, and entirely indifferent to the fact she was tearing the last of my family apart. I stepped into Charleston County Courthouse, air thick with floor wax and old paper footsteps echoing against high ceilings. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting geometric shadows across polished marble. Judge Holloway sat behind the bench like a gargoyle of law eyes, weathered by decades of seeing Charleston's worst. I sat in the front row as Preston Ward was led in, stripped of designer suits and swagger. He wore standard orange that looked like a structural defect against mahogany paneling. The prosecution presented the Predator's journal and Milo's recordings, painting a picture of a man who treated homicide as line-item expense. They detailed Margaret Thornton's boating accident, Susan Whitfield's drowning, and the meticulous planning of my attempted murder. The courtroom fell silent as they played audio of Preston's motel confession. I did what was necessary for the fund. You don't build a legacy. Mr. Ward, Judge Holloway said, voice a low, growly vibration. You build a cemetery. Preston refused to look at me, jaw set in final arrogance. The sharp clack of the gavel sounded like a demolition ball. Life without the possibility of parole. The second trial followed immediately, cutting deeper. Marcus Webb, Preston's biological brother and co-conspirator, was led in wearing chains. The corrupt lawyer had been apprehended at Atlanta Airport, attempting to board a flight to the Caymans with $3 million in cryptocurrency. His arrest had been swift, Morrison's coordination with federal marshals. Webb's face was resigned as charges were read: conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, fraud, money laundering, obstruction. Evidence was overwhelming: forged power of attorney, shell companies, notarized documents that nearly stripped me of everything. He didn't fight. He simply sat as his attorney negotiated a plea deal for testimony against Preston. 15 years, Judge Holloway announced, gavel striking. No parole eligibility for the first 10. As Webb was led away, he glanced at me, and I saw not remorse, but cold acknowledgement that he'd been outplayed. The prosecution also brought charges against Dr. Sterling. Hayes, the cognitive consultant, Preston, had paid to fabricate my incompetency evaluation. Hayes's medical license was permanently revoked by the South Carolina Board of Medical Examiners, and he received a 3-year suspended sentence for professional misconduct and conspiracy to commit fraud. The watch he'd worn Preston's hedge fund merchandise was entered into evidence as proof of their financial relationship. Justice, it seemed, had a long memory for those who weaponized medicine against the vulnerable. The tone shifted to profound tragedy as Leona took the stand. She looked a shell designer clothes replaced by simple gray dress, face bare of makeup. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy, grand larceny, elder abuse, voice barely a whisper as she recounted her role. I wanted the life he promised. I didn't care who I had to step on, even my own father. I sat and watched my daughter accept responsibility for crimes that would cost 7 years, and I felt the weight of every parental decision pressing down. Despite her cooperation testimony securing Preston's conviction, her role in the motel, the scale was too great. 7 years, Judge Holloway said, voice softening slightly, with credit for time served and parole possibility. After 5 contingent on demonstrated rehabilitation, I watched her being handcuffed silver bracelets, a cruel echo of designer watches she once coveted. As she was led out, she turned one last time. "I'm sorry, Daddy?" she mouthed, tears streaming. I nodded, unable to speak. After adjournment, Morrison handed me a heavy folder containing court-ordered restitution and Mount Pleasant estate dissolution. I was granted full permanent guardianship of Milo and Lark, marking the start of a different architectural project, one requiring patience, love, and foundation built on honesty rather than gold. "They're safe now," Thane Morrison said on the courthouse steps, "but they're going to need shoring up." I looked at the folder, then at the empty space where my daughter had stood, and realized the hardest part of being an architect wasn't the building. It was knowing which parts of a ruin were worth saving. I spent the morning checking railings on the back porch. Not because I didn't trust the wood, but because verifying every support beam had become the only way I knew how to breathe. 6 months had passed since the trials. 6 months of learning to be a full-time guardian while carrying the weight of a daughter locked behind bars. The visiting room at Leith Correctional Institution smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. I sat at a small metal table, hands folded, waiting for the guard to bring Leona out. Milo and Lark sat beside me, young faces tense. "It's okay to be nervous," I told them quietly. "She's going to look different, but she's still your mom." The door buzzed open and Leona walked in. The transformation was structural designer labels gone, replaced by standard beige uniform. Her hair was pulled back, face bare eyes, carrying a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "Daddy," she whispered, voice breaking. "I didn't think you'd come." Milo and Lark launched themselves at the plexiglass barrier, hands pressed against the surface. "Mom, we missed you." Leona pressed her own hands against the glass, matching their small palms. "I missed you too, babies, every single day." The guard allowed a brief contact visit, a privilege earned through good behavior. She hugged Milo and Lark with a desperation that spoke of 6 months separation. When she released them, she turned to me. "I don't know how to start. Dad, I don't know how to apologize." "Forgiveness isn't a sudden coat of paint, Leona," I replied, taking her hand. "It's the slow process of sanding down old layers until you find smooth wood underneath." She told me about the forensic accounting degree, the therapy sessions confronting the materialism that made her vulnerable. "I want to help people like you, Dad, track down predators so no one else goes through this." Leona pulled out a handwritten letter, hands shaking. She read aloud a detailed accounting of every decision, every forged signature, every moment she'd chosen. Silence over truth. Not an excuse, a confession. At the end, she looked directly at me. "I chose the gold over you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving I understand what I lost." I reached into my jacket and pulled out Helen's note. "Your mother knew Leona," I said quietly. She saw the shadows in Preston's eyes before any of us did. Leona unfolded it with trembling hands, reading the elegant script. "Don't let our daughter lose her way in the shadows." Tears streamed as she pressed it to her chest. "Mom tried to save me," she whispered, "and I didn't listen." As the guard signaled time was up, Milo handed his mother a drawing, a sketch of the Trad Street house with all of us on the porch, including a small figure labeled "Mom coming home soon." Leona held it to her chest. "I'll be home, and when I am, I'll be the mother you deserve." As we walked out into bright November sun, Lark slipped her hand into mine. "Do you think she meant it, Grandpa?" I looked back at the gray concrete building, then down at her hopeful face. I think she's finally building a foundation worth standing on. 3 years later, I stood at the water's edge, fingers tracing the cold reinforced steel of the new railing along the Ashley River Promenade. A small memorial plaque honored Margaret and Susan. The women Preston had treated like disposable scaffolding. The double-bolted supports were exactly what I had recommended. You can't stop the tide, but you can make sure the pilings are deep enough to hold. Never let them tell you that your years have made you weak. Your years are your reinforcement. I reflected on the true meaning of family structure, thinking of Milo's keen eye and Lark's resilience. They were the load-bearing beams of a future that a predator tried to demolish. Even Leona's scars were part of the foundation. Now the oldest buildings know how to survive the storm. I looked out at the Charleston winter sunset, the sky turning deep purple. I have signed over the garrison firm to Milo, ensuring the legacy continues through the boy who saw the first crack in the wall. Life isn't a finished drawing. It's a constant revision of blueprints until the structure can stand on its own. I turned my back on the river and walked toward the light of my home, knowing that while the water would always be there, I finally knew how to build a bridge that would never break. Looking back now, I realized this was never just a fight for survival. It was a painful family story about blindness, pride, and the dangerous comfort of trusting the wrong people. For years, I believed that providing for my family was enough. I thought that love, silence, and patience would somehow hold everything together. But the truth I learned from this family story is simple when respect disappears. The foundation of a family is already beginning to crack. If you take anything from my family story, let it be this. Never ignore the warning signs simply because the person hurting you shares your last name. Some people watching might call what happened a dad revenge, but in my heart it never felt like revenge. A real dad revenge would have been driven by anger and bitterness. What I chose instead was something harder: boundaries, truth, and the courage to stand up before everything collapsed. If there is one mistake I hope you never repeat from my journey, it is sacrificing your dignity just to keep the peace. Sometimes people describe my actions as a dad revenge, but for me it was about protecting the innocent and refusing to let evil hide behind the word family. I also learned something deeper about faith. There were moments when I thought the river would be the end of my story, but somehow the truth surfaced at exactly the right time. I believe that God has a way of revealing what is hidden when the moment is right, even when darkness seems stronger. Thank you for walking with me all the way to the end of this journey. I'd truly like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you found yourself in that same impossible situation I faced? Your perspective matters more than you know. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. And a gentle note, while the narrative touches on real-world themes and social issues, certain elements were dramatized to enhance the storytelling experience. If this type of story isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that may suit you.